This watch is overpriced. This watch represents great value. What were they thinking when they set their MSRP for this watch? Get it on the secondary market. Whether you read watch-related content or you watch a lot of YouTubers like me, you'll likely hear statements like those thrown around quite a bit. There's this almost implicit rule set of when a watch is good value and when it isn't that we all instinctively adhere to. But nobody elaborates on this rule set. But that's about to change. I'll lay out my own guiding framework for understanding what I think constitutes good value. Hint, it boils down to what you can see, what you can't, and what it says on the dial. Let's dive in. Let's start at $1,000. What's the differentiator here in terms of value? We have the Doxa Sub 200, the Hamilton Khaki Field Expedition, and the Christopher Ward C65 Dune. The first with 200 meters of water resistance, the rest with 100 meters. The Doxa has a 2824 movement from ETA, the Hamilton has an ETA H10 movement, and CW has a Celita. On paper, you'll look at the Hamilton and notice that it has an 80-hour power reserve, which blows the other two out of the water. How did they manage that at this price point? Simple. They lowered the beat rate. This might not be important to you, but there is a noticeable difference between 4 Hz and 3 Hz. It's the difference between smooth and clunky. If you correct for the beat rate, you by and large have 3 highly comparable movements. At $1,000, it's very much about what you can see. The Hamilton is all brushed. Case, bezel, bracelet, all of it. The Doxa has got a brushed and polished case with some beveling. The bracelet, it has multiple finishing techniques. The dial has applied markers. The C65, brushed and polished case. Excellent attention to machine details. A highly polished bezel. Applied markers. When you see a watch like the ones from Studio Underdog, you see an investment has been made in making an interesting dial design. Have they skimped on the movement? Largely no, it's a Celita. The SW210 is a fairly rugged movement. They haven't just dumped in a quartz movement or a Ronda or whatever. At about $1,000, you can more often than not plainly see with the eye who has skimped and put the most work into the watch. You can argue that a watch like the Hamilton is designed to look toolish without the applied markers and with the all-brushed case. That's a very fair point. But there's a reason that you find a lot of basic tool watches in this price range. It's cost-effective to put something together with very rudimentary finishing and design that comes across as good value. Listen to people talk about tool watches and they'll often praise how the watch isn't shiny, how it's not as luxury looking as the Explorer, more real, more authentic, and perhaps it is, but make no mistake, they are saving a bucket load on production costs with those design choices, and you should do well to look at similarly priced watches if for no other reason than to know what you're missing out on. I just had to add this little digression as a piece of all this. It's something I may go into detail on in another video. But basically, in the low end, you're starting to see something become more prevalent, and that is non-repairable or partially plastic movements. We for the longest time had this line between quartz and mechanical. The mechanical race has for decades been a race towards quartz-like specifications. Accuracy, anti-magnetic properties, anti-shock, and all the rest. The key tenet of mechanical has for the most part been that mechanical watches are repairable, but not as much anymore. The Swatch System 51, which you find in the Swatch 50 Fathoms, is an unrepairable movement. If it breaks down, Swatch just chucks the movement out and throws in a new one. I've been coming across more and more movements where the manufacturer in the low end either exchanges the entire movement or the movement even has more synthetic components that in large part potentially shorten the lifespan of the movement. You also see more movements with insanely long power reserves that have achieved this by more or less solely reducing the frequency of the movement. In the race to make low-end watches appealing, they still need to be mechanical to many people, and there are a lot of companies that are resorting to these non-repairable, partially plastic, lower frequency movements to a much larger degree than they did before. And it's something you just need to be aware of, and it's even more now than ever before the case that not all movements are created equal. Is it bad? No. It's just something you need to be aware of as a buyer. Do your research is all I'm saying. Moving on up to $3,000 to $4,000, it's all about the unseen. The Oris Diver 65, the Tudor Black Bay, and the Seiko SJE 093. These watches all serve the same core demographic of vintage-inspired skin divers in a reasonably small case, with a thin bezel, domed sapphire crystal, steel bracelet, and relatively decent levels of finishing. These watches are all a tad over $3,000. They are not identically priced, with the Black Bay being the most expensive, followed by the Seiko, and depending on the Oris model, as there are quite a few, comes in potentially as the cheapest. Now, What's special about this price range is that it's probably the most competitive price range out there. At this price range, you will start to notice that cases aren't just sandblasted or matte anymore like the $1,000 range. They are levels of finishing that consistently start to kick in across the board. You'll see a high polish here and there. You'll potentially see chamfering and beveling and other more intricate machining techniques that you won't see as often below $3,000. You won't always see it, but it's usually more of a consequence of the design choices of the watchmaker, more so than a consequence of the price. If the manufacturer wants to add beveling at this price point, they can and they will. This is also the case with these three watches. From a base finishing perspective, the Oris is the most basically finished together with the SJE 093 that is definitely designed with the intent of being as close to the original 62 MAS as possible. The Black Bay is by far the case with the most extra work put in. When it comes to the dial, all three are remarkably similar. All have applied markers and lume plots. All have domed sapphire crystal. These watches overall are remarkably visually similar in many ways. The key is that you can't draw the same conclusions based on what you can see at $1,000. The clue though lies in the Black Bay. That is the most expensive, and intuitively it makes sense for mainly two reasons, specifically two less visible reasons. Of the bunch, the Black Bay has by far the best movement with the longest power reserve and an easy adjust bracelet. Using the Black Bay 54, the most expensive of the bunch, as our starting point for comparison, we basically know that COSC certification, 70 hours of power reserve, and a solid bracelet is doable at about $4,000. The two others don't have that, but they're also cheaper. Yet the Seiko, spoiler alert, is usually the one with the most complaints about value. Well, here are the reasons. The Diver 65 in its base model costs just a touch under $3,000. You get a 38mm model that has three things against it compared to the Black Bay 54. It has a non-COSC certified Celita movement with only 38 hours of power reserve. It has no easy adjust bracelet, and it has only 100 meters of water resistance. Now the Seiko, well, it's got 200 meters of water resistance, but it has no COSC certification either, and also no easy adjust bracelet. Actually, it comes on a rubber strap only for $3,500. Does it cost $500 to get in 200 meters of water resistance? I would say no, but the key is of course the movement in this case. Oris has the Diver 6512, which has the caliber 400 inside, 120 hours of power reserve. This watch costs around $4,000. It's not COSC certified, but Oris claims that it operates very close to COSC parameters. Keep in mind that COSC certification has a cost associated with it. Foregoing the certification does not mean you lose the accuracy, but Oris, of course, does not guarantee it. What is abundantly clear, though, is that for $4,000, Oris and Tudor can get you more than 70 hours of power reserve and a highly accurate movement plus a steel bracelet. Oris can also get you a serviceable 40-hour-ish movement for under $3,000. The Seiko, price-wise middle of the pack, has the inferior bracelet and an under-spec movement for the price range. These two things are what hurt the Seiko value proposition. At this price point, the brands that are less good value are almost always skimping on the movement and bracelets and other things that you cannot see with the naked eye. The cases will be good, the dials will be good, the tolerances of things like rotating bezels will be good, but here it's the unseeable things. Those unseen things are what you should be paying attention to. So, at $1,000 you can often see the difference between good and less good value. Between $3,000 and $4,000-ish you have to pay attention to what you don't see with the naked eye. Now, I took a leap up to $8,000 and above. What's the key here? It's complicated, but from a value proposition, it's very easy to feel ripped off in this price range. I've said before that up to $6,000, I do feel there's a reasonable relationship between the price increase and the value increase in terms of what you get in a watch. When you get somewhere above this point, it's no longer the case necessarily. You have something like the Omega Seamaster that comes in at just under $8,000. It's a diver, 300 meters of water resistance, 50 hours of power reserve with a METAS movement. It's got complex finishing, applied markers, but it's got high-end specs. Then you've got the Rolex Submariner, just under $10,000. 300 meters of water resistance, 70 hours of power reserve. It's not METAS, but Rolex Superlative Chronometer specification. It's got detailed finishing, it's got high-end specs. Finally, you have the Glasshoot CQ Panorama Date, 100 hours of power reserve, 300 meters of water resistance, impeccably finished. This looks easy, right? But the CQ comes in at over $15,000. It's all about the unseen then, right? Can you discern objectively which is the best movement of the three? It's not as simple as that. The CQ movement is an absolute stunner to behold. Glashütte in their movements just generally do finishing on a level where Rolex and Omega cannot compete. Omega generally gets lauded for the 8800 movement, but that's not Glashütte's value proposition. The point though is at these price points, you just can't boil it down to a comparison of specs. What you see will almost always be on par. Personally, I feel I can see that the CQ is best put together, followed very closely by the Rolex and not far behind the Omega. But I would concede that others might come to a completely different conclusion. The Omega is the cheapest and in bad need of an upgrade, but I'm not holding it against it. The 8800 movement is getting a little bit long in the tooth, but is still one of the best in the business. The bracelet needs an update too, and so too I think does the overall case design, but I'm going to let it slide because this watch has for the longest time been an excellent offering. To you it might seem that I'm going around in circles. I've said that you can't boil down value to the seen here like in the $1,000 range. I've also made it clear that you can't boil it down to the unseen as in the $3,000 or $4,000 range. No, at this price range there are two things you need. First, at this price range you have to check the secondary market prices. You must go to Chrono24 and watch charts and check what people are selling those watches for. You can do that at all price ranges of course, but one, it's a lot of work looking at resale value for a $1,000 watch. Plus, there are very, very few watches under $5,000 that don't drop in price on the secondary market. Yes, Tudor has a couple of months after releases of new models where they are above retail, but even they drop below retail eventually once the hype has died off. Look at these watches' cost on the secondary market. The Rolex holds its value. The CQ takes a huge dive and the Omega has a bit of a drop as well. But the order ends up being Rolex, CQ, Omega in terms of price. And I do think the market is right. The Rolex is likely best value. The CQ is justifiably more expensive than the Omega, and the Omega is great value but not as good as the two others, at least according to the market. Then there's the second piece, because at this price point, emotion and connection starts to kick in. It's not just about market value, it's significantly more about perceived personal value. The value propositions at these kind of price points are wildly divergent. Hublot, as an example, is entirely brand dependent. You pay close to $8,000 for a watch with a rubber strap and a non-Cosc Sellita movement. That's what you're paying for. No more, no less, no criticism, just stating facts. JLC is all about being the almost not quite Holy Trinity heritage watchmaker. With Glashütte, you are paying for old school watchmaking techniques. Some of it is not visible to the naked eye, but that is their value proposition. They are not trying to compete with Rolex on superlative chronometer specs. They are leaning heavily into classic Glashütte watchmaking skills. Omega still offers remarkable technically competent watches, and although, as I said, the specs are long in the tooth by now, they have for the longest time been a bang for the buck watchmaker. And Rolex, whether you like it or not, they have a sweet spot of being probably the best mass-produced luxury watch in the world. You pay for a brand and a technical product, movement, finishing and so on, that aligns very well with price. None of these brands compete at a detailed level with the same type of offering. Again, where Tudor, Longines, Oris and Seiko are fairly closely positioned in their price range, it's just not the case up here. It's easy to criticize Hublot, but the fact is leaning heavily into brand is a perfectly acceptable business strategy. They have a clear demographic that likes their watches, and getting into a spec-for-spec competition with Rolex or Glashütte is pointless. Hublot doesn't care, and neither should you. Their value prop does not speak to you. On the other end of the scale, I know people that put huge value into what Glashütte offers. They're happy to pay for that intricate movement. Some people are willing to pay for the fact that some part of the movement is hand finished. And the Omega? We all know Omega fanboys are unwavering in their support for the brand. Specs and resale value be damned. In short, at this price point, you have to look at the specific brand. Rolex, Omega, JLC, Hublot, Glashütte. And you have to decide, do you like the story and their specific offering? You cannot compare. You can be informed on technical specifications and the like, but at the end of the day, you assign value to the brand, like it or not. We have to set aside the more general complaints about watch pricing. Watches are first of all expensive just in general. They are a luxury good, and the markups relative to what they actually often cost to produce can be, potentially obscene. But that's just the way it is. You want something shiny on your wrist and it's going to cost more than it objectively should. Second, we also have to set aside that most watchmakers got really greedy under COVID. The watchmakers went bananas, and we as consumers sent the signal to Rolex, JLC, Tag Heuer, and Audemars Piguet that we were perfectly willing to pay whatever they demanded to get their watches. Yes, there were flippers, but somebody was buying those watches from flippers as well. So the producers raised prices. The market is currently contracting. Rolex, AP, and Patek secondary prices are dropping. Richemont just announced that their watch business contracted in the last half year. Things are going down, but don't expect to see MSRPs dropping. Those high prices are here to stay. But that doesn't mean you should blindly hand over your money. At the lower end, look at the watch. You can to a large extent see what you're getting for your money. Put watches side by side. At the mid-end, you have to check the spec sheet. You have to dive under the surface and figure out where somebody may be skimping. And then, in that high end of mass-produced watches, you just have to accept that value is subjective to a large part. Secondary market prices give you an indication, but the fact is that the logo, and more importantly what the logo stands for, JLC, the historic watchmaker, the outsider to the Holy Trinity, Rolex, the ultimate mass-produced luxury icon, Glashütte, the Lange Light. That's your call. At $8,000 or $10,000 or $15,000, your purchase of a chunk of metal that does something your phone can do better is fundamentally irrational and totally subjective. It's your choice. Some people won't understand, but it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is if it has value for you. Does the concept of value even make sense in an $8,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 watch? Some might even say it doesn't make sense in a $1,000 watch. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.